All right, this video is going to start the muscles of the torso, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently. I'm not going to go over all the muscles of the torso. This is just mostly going to be focusing on our muscles of the spinal column, the muscles of of our respiratory muscles, and our abdominal wall muscles, or sometimes what's considered your core muscles. So to get us started, we're actually looking at our pretty much only muscles we're going to learn about for the spinal vertebral column. And so this is going to be our erector spinae group. And so it's kind of in the name, it's a group of muscles. So that's the group part. And then erector spinae, they simply erect the spine. And so we've got 3 muscles in the erector spinae group. And obviously you've got 6 in total in your back. You've got iliocostalis, which is I, longissimus, which is L, spinalis, which is S. And then there's a mnemonic with that, which we'll get into in a second. So we'll notice we've got this most lateral muscle here. We've got this sort of intermediate or middle muscle here. And then here we've got this most medial muscle that's closest to the spine. And so our mnemonic is I love sleep. So iliocostalis or I, longissimus, love, spinalis, sleep. And the benefit of this mnemonic is it not just helps them understand what the muscles of the erector spinae group are, but the order they're in. So I, or iliocostalis, comes first. So that one on the most lateral one is our iliocostalis. Love, or longissimus, is in the middle there, and that's in the middle of our mnemonic. And then sleep is spinalis, and spinalis, just funny enough, happens to be the one that's closest to the spine. So that's our mnemonic. I love sleep. And so shifting our focus from the vertebral column muscles to the respiratory muscles, here we've got our diaphragm. And we're probably all pretty familiar with that, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. It's the prime mover of inspiration, which is like breathing in. And so if I just kind of quickly highlight the diaphragm here very quickly, this whole sort of dome-shaped muscle is our diaphragm. Again, prime mover of inspiration, and it's going to separate what would be the thoracic cavity up here. You can see the lungs and trachea and bronchi there from the abdominal cavity, which would be kind of present down there. So we've got some other respiratory muscles we need to talk about too, and that's going to be our intercostal muscles, which if I come down here to this model, we'll notice that the intercostal muscles, so they're named inter because that kind of means between. So if we think like interstitial fluid, the inter part means sort of between the cells. Well, intercostalis, costals meaning ribs, so between the rib muscles is essentially what this is named for. So if we look between our ribs, we'll notice there's a set of muscles right there. There's a set of muscles right there. And so don't get confused with the muscles that are actually on the rib. We'll talk about those later, like these ones right there. Those muscles that rest on the rib are actually a different muscle than the muscles that rest between the ribs. And so the muscles between the ribs are intercostal muscles, and we have 2 types. We've got our external and our internal. It's going to be a little hard to see on this image, but you'll notice there's a line of like demarcation right there that kind of separates this side over here from this side right here. And that line is going to represent where the external intercostal stops and the internal begins. And so if I erase this here, let's actually come over here. You'll notice right on this image, you'll probably be able to notice that this side right here is actually a little bit more elevated. So if we had the model in front of us and you ran your finger over that line, you'd be able to feel which side was more elevated. And so this more elevated side right here is actually going to be your external intercostals. And that makes sense because they're external because they're most superficial. So the most like superficial or raised layer of those intercostals would be the external. And then conversely, the most sort of deeper layer here, the one that isn't as raised, would be your internal intercostals. You can kind of see there's one right there, and then the external would be right there. And again, don't get confused with these muscles right here, which sit on the rib. The muscles on the rib are different muscles. We're looking at the muscles between the ribs. And then once we identify the muscles between the ribs, we say, okay, is it more raised or is it less raised? And if it's more raised, it means it's superficial or external. If it's less raised, it means it's deeper or internal. And so then we can say, okay, well, we've got our internal intercostal right there. And then we have our external intercostal right there. And unfortunately, this is one of the ones I will probably talk about what they do just because it's a little confusing. So unfortunately, the internal intercostal, this is your internal intercostal, what it does is it's responsible for assisting in expiration, specifically forced expiration. And then we have our external intercostal. And what it does is it helps the diaphragm with inspiration. So it's a little unfortunate because the internals do expiration, externals do inspiration. So just remember, you're going to want to say internal is inspiration and just do the opposite of that. And that's how I remember which one does which. So there's our internal intercostals and our external intercostals, and those are going to assist the diaphragm in respiratory movements. And so now to kind of focus on the bulk of the content here, we've got our abdominal sort of plate here. And this is going to house sort of our abdominal wall muscles, or what, again, are kind of usually considered our core muscles. So these ones can be a little more confusing than you would think just because it's hard to identify layers. But that's actually what's going to be really important with helping students understand what they're looking at. So if we look here, probably the easiest one to get out the way is going to be these sort of big blocks right here. And these are the ones that everyone knows and love. This is your six-pack or your rectus abdominis. And so these are probably to understand what they are and what they do. Everyone's worked these out before. And so this is also one of the ones that they're going to need to know the origin insertion for. And so kind of thinking about our understanding of muscles, that origin or insertion moves to origin. Well, when you sort of do a curl up, this part up here is going to move down to, actually it's be further down, to the pelvis down here. And so the rectus abdominis muscles actually originate on the pelvic bones, or they specifically originate on the pelvic crest and sort of that pubic symphysis right there. And then they're going to insert up here, and I probably should even write this a little bit higher. They're going to insert up here on the xiphoid process, and they're going to also insert over here onto these costal cartilages, so that cartilage here of the ribs. And so all that right there is going to, these costal cartilages are insertion sites, just like the xiphoid process is, and then the origin down here is like the pubic symphysis and the pubic crest. And of course, they'll be identifying all those when they look at their bone models in lab. So we said, okay, we've got our rectus abdominis. That one's pretty obvious. The biggest thing here is we've got this giant sheath here of connective tissue. And this is actually going to be really important for them to understand what they're looking at. And so I always actually like to point this out because they don't need to know what it is, but they do need to know what it represents. And we'll actually kind of break that down here in a second. So if you look here, what you'll notice is that, surprise, surprise, the rectus abdominis is actually underneath this sheath here. So these are all those blocks of that rectus abdominis muscle. And this is important because what this tells us is that outside of the skin, this connective tissue is very superficial. It's pretty much right up underneath the skin. And that's important because what that means is that everything on this side over here that I'm quickly highlighting, that means all that stuff is more deep. And then if I erase this here, that means everything we see over here is more superficial. And so that's very important because now when we ask them, okay, where are the internal and external obliques? Well, where do we think they are? We've got the internal, which are going to be on the deep side, and the external obliques, which are going to be on the superficial side. So that's why I really like to point out this connective tissue because they don't need to know it, but it'll help them understand what they're looking at. And so the obliques, again, sometimes people are pretty familiar with these ones too. Those are those muscles kind of on the side of your torso. So we've got a pair right here that I'm quickly highlighting. And they kind of go this way. And then we've got another pair right here that's also highlighted that way, like so. And so again, we say, okay, kind of like the internal, external intercostals. We say, where's our external oblique and where's our internal oblique? Well, we've now identified that this right here superficial side, so we can probably say that these right here are the external obliques. And likewise, we've identified this is the deep side, so this means this is the internal obliques. So understanding that is really helpful, and you can also kind of notice that because guess what? We can see those ribs right here, and we don't see them on this side over here. Sorry, we don't see them right here, which is telling us that we're looking at a more superficial versus deep view. So we've got rectus abdominis, internal obliques and external obliques. And then we've got another muscle that we need to kind of concern ourselves with, and that's called the transversus abdominis. So this one is actually not going to be visible on the front side of the body, but if we come over here, we'll notice that we're looking at the back now. So this is sort of like if we're looking at the back of this plate here, we'll notice that there's these, so if we think back to our planes, we've got like the coronal plane, we've got the sagittal plane, the transverse plane. So transverse plane runs sort of, it cuts the body top to bottom. So it kind of runs that left to right direction or right to left. Well, if we notice here, look at this. We've got these fibers here that are very internal that are running along that transverse plane. And so surprise, surprise, we call this, because it's in the abdominal region, those fibers run in the transverse direction, we call it the transverse abdominis. And you'll notice here, actually I won't mention that because it might just get a little confusing. But yeah, so this is going to be your transverse abdominis. And then you can kind of see here, there's a little bit of that rectus abdominis right there. So that's the transverse abdominis. And I really like this image right here because this image kind of helps show everything together. We've got that connective tissue sheet we were talking about right here. And then if we kind of look at the muscle, so we say this is the deepest layer. So if we look right here, we'll say, oh, look at that. We've got an oblique right there, and that oblique is our external oblique. It kind of runs continuous with that big connective tissue sheet. And then if we look directly underneath that sheet, we've got this muscle right here, and that's our rectus abdominis. And on the same level there, let's actually look over here, we've got up underneath that, on the same level of rectus abdominis, so right here, or you could also look at it up underneath the external oblique right here, we've got that internal oblique. And then if we look even deeper than that, we'll notice, oh, there's those transverse running fibers. Well, that is the transverse abdominis. So that's going to be the end of the video here. That's going to be all of our muscles regarding the abdominal cavity. I know I kind of went through it pretty quickly, but this is just probably just mostly a review for you guys anyways. So I will come back with the videos covering the rest of the torso models, and then we'll kind of work into the appendages.